It started as a routine traffic stop, but for James, an accomplished black engineer, it quickly turned into something more unsettling. The officer smirked as he questioned James's career claims, making thinly veiled remarks about his disbelief. With a calm demeanor and quiet strength, James explained his work in cutting-edge technology, but the skepticism in the officer's eyes said it all. Fast forward a few months, and James stood in front of an audience at a major tech conference. The same officer was seated in the crowd, invited as a guest of the event. As James walked onto the stage, introducing himself as the CEO of one of the fastest-growing companies in the industry, all eyes turned to the officer's reaction. What happens next is a story of perseverance, humility, and a powerful reminder never to judge a book by its cover. Stay tuned, you won't want to miss this. James had always been underestimated. Growing up, he was the kid who loved tinkering with broken radios and old computers, while others doubted he'd ever achieve anything significant. He worked hard, studying engineering at a top university, and eventually built a career designing innovative technologies. Despite his success, James often found himself facing subtle prejudices, like the looks people gave when he walked into boardrooms or the assumptions made when he introduced himself at networking events. That day during the traffic stop, he had felt it again. The officer's dismissive tone and probing questions weren't just about his license and registration. It was as if the officer couldn't reconcile James' appearance with his achievements. James didn't argue. He let his actions speak louder. Now, standing on stage as a celebrated CEO, the moment was about more than proving the officer wrong. It was about showing the world the power of resilience and self-belief. As James looked out at the crowd, his mind wandered back to the countless hurdles he had faced. The long nights spent working on his startup while juggling a full-time job. The investors who doubted his vision. The industry conferences where his ideas were overlooked until someone else repeated them. It wasn't just the officer from that day who had underestimated him. James had faced doubt at every turn, but he had learned to channel it into fuel for his ambitions. The officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier smirk replaced by a more subdued expression. James noticed, but didn't linger on it. This moment wasn't about personal vindication. It was about something much bigger. It was about inspiring others who had been dismissed or marginalized to push forward. The tension in the room was palpable as James began to speak, sharing the story of his journey. James's voice carried through the room, calm but commanding, as he shared his journey. He spoke of the nights he doubted himself, the moments when it felt easier to give up, and the times when people questioned his right to even be in the spaces he was fighting to enter. The audience hung on every word, captivated by his honesty and resilience. But there was something else in the room, an almost electric tension as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The officer, now fully aware of who James was, seemed frozen in his seat. His earlier assumptions about James clashed with the truth unfolding before him. James, though, didn't dwell on the officer's reaction. His focus remained on the message he wanted to share, how every setback he faced had shaped him, how the disbelief of others became the backdrop to his greatest achievements. As James paused, the silence was deafening. The crowd leaned in, waiting for the next part of his story. Would he address the officer directly? Would he reveal the full weight of what had happened during that traffic stop? Every second stretched longer, the anticipation building to an almost unbearable peaky, while leaving everyone wondering. How did he get here? Just as James was about to continue, a hand raised from the crowd. It was the officer. The room turned, a ripple of whispers spreading like wildfire. James hesitated for a moment but nodded, allowing him to speak. The officer stood, visibly uneasy but determined, and addressed the audience. He admitted to being the officer from that day, his voice trembling slightly as he explained his side of the encounter. He claimed he hadn't meant to offend, but acknowledged that his actions had come across as dismissive. The audience was stunned, unsure how James would respond. But instead of addressing the officer directly, James took a deep breath and turned back to the crowd. That day wasn't about him, he said, his voice steady. It was about how often people in my position are doubted, how we're made to feel like we have to prove ourselves over and over again just to exist in certain spaces. The stakes felt higher now, the story no longer just about James's personal victory, but about a larger conversation around bias and perception. The officer remained standing, visibly grappling with the weight of James's words. The tension in the room thickened as James prepared to deliver the final part of his speech, leaving everyone wondering how this unexpected confrontation would unfold. James paused, his eyes scanning the audience before finally settling on the officer. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the stage lights. "What matters most," James continued, "is what we do when we're faced with those moments of doubt, whether we're the ones being underestimated or the ones doing the underestimating." He turned to the officer, his voice calm but firm. "I hope this moment challenges you to see people differently, to ask yourself why you assumed I couldn't be who I said I was." The officer nodded, his expression shifting from discomfort to something closer to understanding. But then James did something no one expected. He reached out his hand toward the officer. "It's never too late to change how we see each other," he said. The officer hesitated, then walked to the stage and shook James's hand, earning a standing ovation from the audience. As the applause thundered, James revealed one final twist. "What you didn't know," he said with a smile, "is that the technology my company created is now being used by law enforcement agencies across the country, including yours." The officer looked stunned, and the crowd erupted again. It was a moment of redemption, humility, and hope, a reminder of the power of perseverance and the possibility of change. As the applause settled and the officer returned to his seat, James took a moment to reflect. "This isn't just my story," he said, addressing the audience. "It's the story of countless others who face doubt and bias every day. But moments like this remind us that change is possible, one conversation, one action at a time." The officer, now looking more thoughtful than defensive, nodded subtly, acknowledging the weight of the moment. James concluded his speech by encouraging everyone in the room to challenge their assumptions, to see potential instead of limits, and to support those working to create change. As James stepped off the stage, he was greeted with handshakes and words of admiration. Walking out of the venue, he felt a sense of closure, not just for himself, but for the message he had delivered. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong, it was about paving the way for what's right.